The ancient land of Mesopotamia, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, holds secrets that challenge everything we think we know about human civilization. And at the heart of this mystery lies a document so extraordinary, so perplexing, that scholars have debated its meaning for over a century. The Sumerian King List, etched in cuneiform script on clay tablets dating back more than 4,000 years, presents us with an enigma that bridges mythology and history, fantasy and fact, the divine and the mortal. This ancient record claims that before the great flood swept across the earth, kings ruled the land of Sumer for reigns lasting not decades, not centuries, but tens of thousands of years, with the total duration of antediluvian kingship reaching an astonishing 241,200 years. Imagine standing in the ruins of ancient Uruk, where the scorching Mesopotamian sun beats down upon crumbling ziggurats and buried temples, knowing that beneath your feet lies evidence of what the Sumerians themselves considered their most sacred history. These weren't mere legends scribbled by imaginative scribes. These were official state records, carefully maintained and copied across generations, treated with the same reverence that modern nations treat their founding documents. The King List begins with a phrase that sends shivers down the spine of anyone who contemplates its implications, a simple statement that carries the weight of ages. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in eridu. This opening declaration tells us that the Sumerians believed their civilization didn't emerge organically from primitive beginnings, but rather was gifted to humanity by celestial beings, divine entities who descended from the heavens to establish order and governance among mankind. The first king mentioned, Alulum of Eridu, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years, a span of time so vast that it encompasses the entire recorded history of human civilization multiple times over. Following Alulum came Alalngar, who ruled for 36,000 years, and then Enmenluana, who held the throne for 43,200 years. The list continues with equally impossible reign lengths. Enmengalana ruled for 28,800 years, Dumuzi the shepherd for 36,000 years, Ensipadzadana for 28,800 years, and Mendarana for 21,000 years, and Ubaratutu for 18,600 years. When we add these numbers together, we arrive at that staggering total of 241,200 years of antediluvian kingship across 5 cities: Eridu, Badtibara, Larag, Zimbir, and Shuruppak. But here's where the story takes an even more fascinating turn, because the King List doesn't treat this antediluvian period as fundamentally different in nature from what came after. It simply presents it as the earliest chapter of an unbroken historical narrative. The text continues, "Then the flood swept over, and after this cataclysmic event, the kingship was lowered from heaven once again, this time to the city of Kish." However, the post-flood kings, while still enjoying extraordinarily long reigns by modern standards, ruled for much more modest periods, typically ranging from a few hundred to a few thousand years. And as the King List progresses through the dynasties, moving from Kish to Uruk to Uar and beyond, the reign lengths gradually decrease until they reach historically plausible durations that align with archaeological evidence and records from neighboring civilizations. This gradual transition from mythological to historical time is one of the most intriguing aspects of the Sumerian King List, suggesting that the ancient scribes who compiled it didn't distinguish sharply between myth and history the way we do today, but rather viewed them as part of a continuous narrative where the distant past naturally blended into the present. The question that has haunted researchers since the King List's discovery and translation is deceptively simple yet profoundly complex. What are we to make of these impossible reign lengths? Are they purely symbolic, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individual rulers? Or do they encode some lost system of timekeeping that we no longer understand? Could they be exaggerations intended to glorify the past and legitimize the present? Or might they preserve distorted memories of actual events and people transmitted through countless generations of oral tradition before being committed to writing? Some scholars have suggested that the antediluvian kings represent not historical individuals but rather mythological archetypes, divine or semi-divine beings who personified various aspects of civilization's origins. Others have proposed that the enormous reign lengths might reflect a different way of measuring time, perhaps counting lunar months instead of solar years, though this explanation fails when we try to apply it consistently across the entire king list. A more esoteric interpretation suggests that these figures might represent the collective reigns of entire dynasties or ruling families, compressed into single names for the sake of narrative simplicity, though this doesn't fully account for why the Sumerians would employ such a confusing system when they were perfectly capable of recording complex genealogies and successions. To understand the Sumerian King List, we must first understand the Sumerians themselves, a people who emerged in southern Mesopotamia sometime around 4500 BCE and who, by 3500 BCE, had developed one of the world's first urban civilizations. The Sumerians gave humanity some of its most fundamental innovations. Writing in the form of cuneiform script, the wheel, the plow, the sailboat, bronze metallurgy, complex irrigation systems, mathematical notation based on the sexagesimal system that we still use today for measuring time and angles, astronomical observations of remarkable accuracy, legal codes, bureaucratic administration, and literary traditions including the world's first known epic, the story of Gilgamesh. Their cities, with names that echo through history like incantations from a forgotten age, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, were not mere villages grown large but carefully planned urban centers featuring monumental architecture, sophisticated water management, specialized craft production, and complex social hierarchies. At the heart of each city stood the ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid serving as both temple and symbolic mountain, connecting the earthly realm to the heavens where the gods dwelled. The Sumerians believed that humans had been created by the gods to serve as their laborers, tending the earth and providing offerings to sustain the divine beings who had shaped the cosmos from primordial chaos. This worldview permeated every aspect of Sumerian life and is essential for understanding documents like the King List, which reflect a deep conviction that kingship itself was a divine institution, literally lowered from heaven to establish order and justice on earth. The concept of me, which the Sumerians believed were divine decrees or fundamental principles governing every aspect of civilization from kingship and priesthood to metalworking and sexual intercourse, were gifts from the gods that made civilized life possible. And the antediluvian kings listed in the King List were the first recipients and custodians of these sacred me. The oldest surviving copy of the Sumerian King List is the weld blundell prism, a clay object discovered in the 1920s and now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. This remarkable artifact, dating to around 2000 BCE during the UR3 period, stands about 8 inches tall and contains 4 columns of cuneiform text inscribed on each of its 4 sides, presenting a comprehensive list of Mesopotamian kings from the legendary antediluvian period down to the reign of Sin-Magir of Isin, who ruled around 1827 BCE. The prism was created during a time when Mesopotamia was politically fragmented, with various city-states competing for supremacy, and the King List served an important ideological function by establishing a framework of legitimate succession, suggesting that true kingship was singular and indivisible, passing from one city to another rather than being shared among multiple contemporary rulers. By tracing this unbroken line of succession back to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven, the King List implicitly argued that whoever currently held the kingship possessed divine sanction for their rule. The scribe who carved the weld blundell prism worked with extraordinary precision, each cuneiform sign carefully impressed into the soft clay before firing, creating a permanent record that would survive 4 millennia to tell us its story. But the weld blundell prism is not unique. Numerous other copies and fragments of the King List have been discovered at various sites across Mesopotamia, each showing slight variations in the names, reign lengths, and cities mentioned, suggesting that the King List existed in multiple versions and was continually updated and revised over centuries to reflect changing political realities and evolving traditions. The variations between different versions raise important questions about the text's composition and transmission. Was there an original, authoritative version from which all others derived? Or did the King List emerge from a broader tradition of royal chronicles maintained independently by different cities and scribal schools? The answer likely lies somewhere between these extremes, with an early core text being elaborated, edited, and adapted over time to serve different purposes in different contexts. When we examine the structure of the King List more closely, we notice a fascinating pattern. The text is organized around the concept of dynasties, with kingship passing from one city to another in a sequential fashion. After the flood, kingship is first established at Kish, where 23 kings ruled for a combined total of more than 24,000 years, though individual reigns within this dynasty range from 1,200 years down to just 3 years, showing the gradual transition toward more realistic numbers. After Kish, kingship passes to Eanna, then back to Kish for a second dynasty, then to Hammasi, then to Uruk for its first dynasty, where we encounter the legendary Gilgamesh, the hero king whose exploits were celebrated in what would become ancient Mesopotamia's greatest epic poem. The King List credits Gilgamesh with a reign of 126 years, a number that is extraordinary by modern standards but positively modest compared to his antediluvian predecessors, and significantly, this reign length aligns roughly with the epic's portrayal of Gilgamesh as a mortal man obsessed with conquering death after the loss of his friend Enkidu. The inclusion of Gilgamesh in the King List is particularly significant because it demonstrates that the document includes at least some figures we know existed in historical memory, even if the details of their lives were embellished and mythologized. Following Uruk's first dynasty, the kingship passes to Ur, then back to Uruk, then to the Awan dynasty, then to Kish again, then to Hammasi, then to the second dynasty of Uruk, and so on through a bewildering succession of cities and dynasties, each claiming its moment as the center of legitimate power in Mesopotamia. As the King List progresses through the 3rd millennium BCE, something remarkable happens. The reign lengths continue to decrease, and the listed kings begin to correspond with rulers known from contemporary inscriptions and administrative records, allowing us to cross-reference the King List with independent historical evidence. By the time we reach the Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE, the King List has fully transitioned from myth into history, and the information it provides can be verified and supplemented by a wealth of other sources including royal inscriptions, administrative documents, letters, and archaeological remains. Sargon himself, according to the King List, ruled for 56 years, a long reign but entirely within the bounds of historical possibility, and we know from other sources that Sargon was indeed a historical figure who created the world's first true empire, uniting the Sumerian city-states and Akkadian territories under a single administration. His grandson Naram-Sin, who ruled for 56 years according to the King List, is documented in hundreds of inscriptions and administrative texts from sites across Mesopotamia, leaving no doubt about his historical existence. This convergence of the King List with independently attested history gives us confidence that the document's later portions are reliable, but it also makes the earlier portions, particularly the antediluvian period, all the more mysterious by contrast. If the Sumerians were capable of keeping accurate records for historically recent periods, why would they include obviously impossible information about the distant past? The key to understanding this apparent contradiction lies in recognizing that the Sumerians didn't share our modern obsession with distinguishing historical fact from mythological tradition. For them, both were essential components of their cultural identity and both served important functions in explaining their place in the cosmos. The antediluvian kings, regardless of whether they ever existed as historical individuals, represented something profoundly meaningful to the Sumerians. They embodied the perfection of the primordial age, a golden time when gods and humans interacted directly, when the earth was new and uncorrupted, when the patterns of civilization were first established that would serve as templates for all future generations. In Sumerian cosmology, the flood represented a decisive break in history, a catastrophic reset that nearly obliterated humanity and necessitated a fresh start under new conditions. The parallels between the Sumerian flood story and the biblical account of Noah's Ark are striking and well documented. But the Sumerian version is considerably older, appearing in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic centuries before the Hebrew Bible was compiled. In the Sumerian tradition, the flood hero is called Ziusudra in Sumerian or Utnapishtim in Akkadian, and like Noah, he is warned by a friendly god about the impending deluge and instructed to build a boat to save himself, his family, and representatives of all living creatures. The gods send the flood because humanity has become too numerous and noisy, disturbing the divine rest, a rationale that suggests the flood was not punishment for moral failings but rather a form of population control, though other versions of the story do include elements of divine judgment against human wickedness. After the floodwaters recede, Ziusudra offers sacrifices to the gods who, famished after being deprived of human offerings during the deluge, swarm around the altar like flies. A detail that adds both humor and pathos to the scene while emphasizing humanity's essential role in the cosmic order. The gods grant Ziusudra and his wife immortality and settle them in Dilmun, a paradisiacal land at the edge of the world, and this same Ziusudra appears in some versions of the King List as Ubaratutu, the last king before the flood. The flood narrative serves as the hinge around which the King List pivots, separating the primordial age from the historical age, the time of divine human intimacy from the time of increasing separation, the era of unimaginable longevity from the era of progressively more mortal lifespans. This structural division reflects a widespread ancient Near Eastern belief that the present age was a degraded reflection of a more glorious past, that humanity had declined from an original state of near perfection, living closer to the gods and enjoying their favor more directly. The gradually decreasing reign lengths in the King List can be understood as encoding this worldview, showing how the vital force of the primordial age gradually dissipated over time, bringing humanity down from the heights of the antediluvian kings to the merely impressive longevity of the early historical kings to the normal human lifespans of later periods. This pattern resonates with similar traditions from other ancient cultures. The Greek concept of declining ages from gold to silver to bronze to iron, the Hindu yugas describing cosmic cycles of decline and renewal, and the biblical patriarchs who lived for centuries but whose lifespans decreased generation by generation after the flood until reaching normal human duration. These parallel traditions suggest that ancient peoples across diverse cultures shared certain intuitions about time, history, and humanity's relationship with the divine. Intuitions that found expression in origin stories and king lists that blended myth and history into unified narratives. Now we must grapple with various theories that scholars have proposed to explain the antediluvian reign lengths, each with its strengths and weaknesses, each revealing something about how we approach ancient texts and what assumptions we bring to our interpretations. The first and most straightforward explanation is that the numbers are purely symbolic or mythological, never intended to be taken literally even by ancient audiences. According to this view, the enormous reign lengths serve to elevate the antediluvian kings into a realm beyond ordinary human experience, marking them as divine or semi-divine beings whose lives unfolded according to different rules than those governing mortal existence. The specific numbers chosen might encode numerological significance that we no longer fully understand, as the Sumerians were sophisticated mathematicians who ascribed mystical properties to certain numbers and ratios. The number 60, the base of their mathematical system, held special importance, and we can see multiples and factors of 60 recurring throughout the King List. Additionally, the total of 241,200 years for the antediluvian period might itself be significant, though scholars have not reached consensus on what meaning it might encode. A second theory proposes that the reign lengths represent not individual rulers but entire dynasties or ruling houses, with single names standing in for sequences of kings who ruled the same city over extended periods. This compression could have occurred during the transmission of oral traditions before the King List was committed to writing, or it might have been a deliberate scribal choice to simplify and schematize the past. However, this theory struggles to explain why the Sumerians would use such a confusing system when they demonstrated perfectly adequate ability to record complex sequences of rulers in the historical portions of the King List. A third explanation suggests mathematical or calendrical confusion, proposing that the antediluvian rain lengths were calculated using a different time system than the solar years we assume. Perhaps they counted lunar months or seasons, or some other unit that would reduce the numbers to more reasonable proportions. If we divide the rain lengths by 12 to convert hypothetical lunar months into solar years, Alulim's reign of 28,800 years becomes 2,000 for 100 years, still impossibly long but closer to the realm of possibility. Yet this mathematical operation, while intriguing, doesn't solve the fundamental problem because 2,000 for 100 years is still far beyond human lifespan. And moreover, the Sumerians definitely knew the difference between months and years and used both in their calendrical systems. A fourth approach suggests that the antediluvian kings might represent tribal or clan leaders whose positions were hereditary and whose reigns actually represent the duration their lineages held power. But this interpretation requires us to assume a level of confusion or metaphorical thinking on the part of the Sumerian scribes that seems inconsistent with their demonstrated sophistication in other areas. A fifth and more esoteric interpretation comes from researchers who take the king list at closer to face value, proposing that it might preserve garbled memories of actual ancient civilizations or advanced cultures that existed in prehistory and were destroyed by flooding or other catastrophes. According to this controversial view, the antediluvian kings might represent real rulers of real cities that were subsequently buried and forgotten, with only legendary memories surviving to be recorded millennia later. Proponents of this theory point to the fact that the king list locates the antediluvian kings in real cities, particularly Eridu, which archaeological evidence confirms as one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers dating back to 5,400 BCE. They also note that the flood narrative appears in numerous ancient cultures and might reflect genuine memories of catastrophic flooding events at the end of the last ice age when rising sea levels inundated coastal settlements. However, mainstream archaeology finds no evidence for the kind of advanced civilization that would be needed to support the king list's claims, and the vast majority of scholars interpret the antediluvian period as mythological rather than historical. The question of the flood itself deserves careful consideration because it represents a pivotal element not just in the king list but in Mesopotamian mythology more broadly. Archaeological evidence confirms that Mesopotamia experienced devastating floods periodically throughout its ancient history. The flat alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates were particularly vulnerable to inundation when both rivers flooded simultaneously or when storm surges from the Persian Gulf pushed inland. Excavations at various Mesopotamian sites have revealed layers of flood sediment interrupting occupation sequences, leading some early archaeologists to claim they had found evidence of the biblical flood, though subsequent analysis showed that these flood layers occurred at different times at different sites and thus couldn't represent a single catastrophic event. What seems most likely is that the memory of various devastating floods became conflated and mythologized over time into the narrative of a single world-destroying deluge, which then served as a convenient chronological marker for dividing prehistory from history. The fact that this flood narrative was so important to the Mesopotamians that they felt compelled to include it in a document as official and authoritative as the king list tells us something profound about their historical consciousness. They understood their civilization as having emerged twice, first in the antediluvian age and then again after the catastrophic reset of the flood, and this double foundation gave special significance to the early post-flood cities and dynasties that had to rebuild civilization from near-total destruction. Let us turn our attention to the cities mentioned in the king list, beginning with Eridu, the first city to receive kingship from heaven according to the text. Eridu holds a special place in Sumerian mythology as the primordial city, the original template from which all other cities derived, and the cult center of Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and crafts, who was believed to live in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean beneath the earth. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, located in what is now southern Iraq, have revealed a remarkable sequence of temples built one atop another over thousands of years, with the earliest structures dating to the Ubaid period around 5400 BCE. making Eridu one of the oldest urban sites in the world. The succession of temples shows a continuous tradition of worship at the same location spanning millennia, exactly the kind of deep time continuity that the King List describes. The city's location near the marshlands at the head of the Persian Gulf gave it access to both riverine and maritime resources, and its foundation in such ancient times meant that by the time the King List was compiled, Eridu already had thousands of years of history behind it, shrouded in the mists of time and impossible to disentangle from mythology. The choice to begin the King List with Eridu was deliberate and meaningful, establishing that legitimate kingship originated in the most sacred and ancient of all Sumerian cities. Bad Tibra, the second antediluvian capital mentioned in the King List, was associated with metalworking and was believed to be the city where Dumuzi, later known as Tammuz, the shepherd god who became a prototype for dying and rising deities throughout the ancient Near East, held sway. Larag, the third city, was associated with the sun god Pabilsag and was known as a center of astronomical observation and calendrical calculation. Zimbir, which is Sapar in Akkadian, was sacred to the sun god Shamash and was later famous for its scribal schools and astronomical texts. Shuruppak, the fifth antediluvian city, was the home of Ziusudra, the flood hero, creating a direct narrative connection between the King List and the flood mythology. The fact that the King List locates the antediluvian kingship in 5 different cities rather than one suggests either that kingship moved from place to place even in primordial times, or that the compiler of the King List was drawing on traditions from multiple cities and weaving them together into a unified narrative, giving each major cult center its moment of primordial glory. The post-flood portion of the King List, while still containing many problematic and exaggerated elements, begins to align more closely with archaeological and historical evidence as we move forward in time. The city of Kish, the first post-flood capital, was a real and important Sumerian city whose archaeological remains confirm its significance in the early dynastic period around 2900 to 2350 BCE. The title King of Kish became a prestige designation claimed by rulers throughout Mesopotamia even after Kish itself had lost political power, suggesting that the city held special legitimacy deriving from its position as the first post-flood dynasty. Uruk, which receives kingship after Kish, was the largest city in the world during the 4th millennium BCE, with massive fortification walls and monumental temples including the famous White Temple dedicated to the sky god Anu. The King List's placement of Gilgamesh in Uruk's first dynasty aligns with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which describes the hero king's construction of Uruk's great walls, and archaeological evidence confirms that Uruk did indeed possess impressive fortifications dating to approximately the time when Gilgamesh supposedly ruled. The city of Ur, which appears multiple times in the King List as the seat of different dynasties, would later become famous as the birthplace of Abraham according to biblical tradition, and its archaeological remains include spectacular royal tombs from the early dynastic period containing treasures of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian as well as evidence of human sacrifice, with servants and musicians buried alongside their royal masters to serve them in the afterlife. These burial practices reveal a society of enormous wealth and sophistication, but also one willing to expend human lives to honor its rulers, suggesting that Mesopotamian kingship was indeed considered sacred and divinely ordained as the King List claims. The question of why the Sumerians compiled the King List in the first place leads us into fascinating territory regarding ancient historiography and political ideology. Unlike modern historical writing, which at least theoretically aims for objectivity and comprehensive coverage, ancient chronicles and King Lists served explicit ideological purposes, legitimizing current rulers by connecting them to glorified pasts and presenting political arrangements as divinely ordained rather than humanly constructed. The King List structure, which presents kingship as singular and sequential rather than divided among multiple contemporary rulers, reflects an idealized vision of political unity that rarely matched the messy reality of Mesopotamian politics, where multiple city-states typically competed for power simultaneously. The compiler of the King List, probably working during the UR3 period around 2100 to 2000 BCE when the third dynasty of UR had briefly reunified Mesopotamia under a single administration, was making an argument about the nature of legitimate authority, suggesting that true kingship could not be shared or divided but must reside in one place at one time, and that whoever currently held the kingship stood in an unbroken line of succession reaching back to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven. This ideological function explains why the King List was so widely copied and preserved. It wasn't just a historical record but a political document, a manifesto about the nature and basis of royal authority. For modern readers, the challenge is to appreciate the King List as a complex artifact that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, combining mythology, theology, historiography, and political propaganda into a unified narrative that made sense within its original cultural context, even if it seems contradictory or impossible to us. We must resist the temptation to judge the King List by modern standards of historical accuracy, and instead try to understand what it meant to its creators and audiences, what work it was doing in Sumerian society, what beliefs and values it expressed and reinforced. The King List tells us that the Sumerians understood themselves as inheritors of an incredibly ancient tradition, that they believed their civilization had been established by divine mandate in the distant past, that they saw their present as connected through an unbroken chain of kingship to that sacred origin, and that they believed the proper order of their world depended on maintaining this connection. These beliefs weren't irrational or primitive. They were sophisticated responses to fundamental human needs for meaning, continuity, and legitimacy, expressed through the narrative frameworks available within their culture. The astronomical and mathematical sophistication evident in Sumerian civilization adds another layer of mystery to the King List because it demonstrates that the Sumerians were capable of precise calculation and careful observation, yet apparently embraced seemingly impossible numbers in their historical traditions. The Sumerians developed the sexagesimal system, counting by 60s rather than 10s, which gave them extraordinary flexibility in working with fractions and which we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds, or when we divide circles into 360 degrees. They tracked the movements of planets with remarkable accuracy, recognizing the regular patterns that allowed prediction of celestial events, and they developed sophisticated methods for calculating areas, volumes, and quantities needed for engineering projects like canal construction and temple building. This mathematical prowess makes it all the more striking that they recorded reign lengths of tens of thousands of years, suggesting that these numbers weren't the result of computational error or primitive thinking but rather served some purpose we don't fully grasp. Some researchers have speculated that the numbers might encode astronomical cycles, with the reign lengths corresponding to periods of planetary motion or precessional ages, but attempts to decode such meanings have produced more speculation than consensus. What we can say with confidence is that numbers held both practical and symbolic significance for the Sumerians, and the numbers in the King List likely operated on both levels, conveying information that was simultaneously mathematical and mythological, precise and poetic. The religious dimension of Sumerian kingship cannot be overstated because it fundamentally shaped how the Mesopotamians understood political authority and social organization. The king was not merely a secular ruler but the earthly representative of the gods, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through proper performance of rituals, construction and maintenance of temples, administration of justice according to divine principles, and leadership in warfare to defend the land the gods had entrusted to human care. The concept that kingship descended from heaven wasn't metaphorical in the way we might understand it today. The Sumerians genuinely believed that the institution of kingship was a divine gift, one of the sacred me handed down from the gods to organize human society. This belief meant that challenges to the king's authority were not merely political disputes but cosmic violations, threats to the divinely ordained order that kept chaos at bay. The king underwent elaborate coronation rituals that symbolically united him with the gods, and he participated in annual ceremonies like the sacred marriage rite in which he ritually united with the goddess Inanna to ensure the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. These religious obligations were not peripheral to kingship but constituted its very essence, and a king who failed to properly perform these duties risked divine disfavor that could manifest as military defeat, natural disaster, or civil unrest. The antediluvian kings in the King List, reigning for such extraordinary periods, represented an age when this divine-human connection was even more direct and powerful than in later times, when kings were perhaps themselves semi-divine rather than merely divinely appointed mortals. As we examine specific antediluvian kings mentioned in the King List, we find that several appear in other Sumerian literary and religious texts, suggesting they were well-established figures in the mythology rather than names invented solely for the King List. Dumuzi, who appears as an antediluvian king of Bad Tibra, was also the subject of numerous poems and laments describing his role as Inanna's consort and his death and descent to the underworld, a mythological pattern that would influence later dying god traditions throughout the Mediterranean world. The pairing of Dumuzi with the shepherd profession in the King List connects him to pastoral life and animal husbandry, one of the fundamental components of Sumerian economy and culture. And Mendaranna, another antediluvian king, has been connected by some scholars with Enki, a legendary king of Sippar who, according to later Babylonian tradition, was taken up to heaven by the gods Shamash and Adad and taught the secrets of divination, including how to interpret omens from the liver of sacrificed animals and from the movements of oil on water. This Enki figure shares striking parallels with the biblical Enoch, who walked with God and was not, for God took him, and both represent a type of primordial sage who mediated between human and divine realms, possessing secret knowledge that would be passed down through priestly lineages. These connections suggest that the antediluvian kings in the King List weren't arbitrary names, but rather drew upon a rich mythological tradition in which these figures played specific roles in explaining the origins of various aspects of civilization. When we compare the Sumerian King List to similar documents from other ancient Near Eastern cultures, we gain valuable perspective on what was unique and what was common in ancient approaches to history and kingship. The Egyptian king lists, inscribed on temple walls and in papyrus documents, also extended back into mythological time, though they handled the transition from divine to human rule differently. The Turin King List, for example, begins with the reigns of the gods themselves, followed by the followers of Horus, who served as transitional figures between divine and human rule, and only then proceeding to the historical dynasties. The Egyptian kings, the pharaohs, were considered living gods rather than representatives of gods, a crucial theological distinction that shaped the entire structure of Egyptian civilization. In the Hebrew Bible, the genealogies in Genesis also contain extraordinarily long lifespans for the antediluvian patriarchs, with Adam living to 930 years, Methuselah reaching 969 years, and Noah living 950 years, though these numbers are measured in centuries rather than millennia and thus are less extreme than the Sumerian King List. The parallels between these traditions, the Sumerian antediluvian kings with their impossibly long reigns, the Egyptian divine rulers, and the biblical patriarchs with their extended lifespans, suggest a shared ancient Near Eastern understanding that the distant past was fundamentally different from the present, that earlier generations lived closer to the divine and participated in a more robust vitality that had since diminished. This pattern reflects not historical reality in the modern sense, but rather a common mythological framework for understanding human history as a story of decline from an original golden age. The archaeological investigation of the cities mentioned in the King List has produced fascinating and sometimes puzzling results that both support and complicate the document's narrative. Eridu, as mentioned, shows occupation from extremely early periods, with its temple sequence suggesting continuous religious activity over millennia. Excavators found that the earliest structures at Eridu were simple reed shrines, gradually replaced over centuries by more elaborate mud-brick temples that maintained the same basic orientation and layout, showing remarkable continuity of sacred space and practice. This archaeological continuity lends credence to Sumerian traditions that Eridu was indeed the primordial city, though it doesn't of course prove anything about the specific kings listed as ruling there. Uruk's archaeology is even more spectacular, revealing not just the famous White Temple, but also enormous administrative complexes that housed the scribes who developed cuneiform writing, primarily for economic record-keeping before it was adapted to literary purposes. The sheer scale of 4th millennium Uruk, with its massive walls that the Epic of Gilgamesh attributes to its legendary king, suggests a level of social organization and resource mobilization that required centralized authority, lending support to the idea that powerful rulers did indeed govern these early cities, even if we cannot confirm the specific names and reign lengths given in the King List. Ur's royal tombs from the early dynastic period, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, revealed burial practices of astonishing richness and violence, with principal burials accompanied by dozens of attendants who had been poisoned or otherwise killed to accompany their masters into the afterlife, their bodies arranged in orderly rows, still wearing the jewelry and carrying the musical instruments they would need to serve in the netherworld. These discoveries provide vivid archaeological confirmation that Mesopotamian kingship was indeed considered sacred and worthy of the ultimate human sacrifice, validating at least the general claims of the King List about the special nature of royal authority, even if the specific details remain unverifiable. The broader question of how to interpret ancient texts that blend historical and mythological elements remains contentious among scholars, with interpretive approaches ranging from hypercritical skepticism that dismisses anything that cannot be independently verified to more sympathetic readings that seek to understand the cultural logic underlying apparently problematic passages. The Sumerian King List exemplifies this interpretive challenge because it demonstrably contains both verifiable historical information about later kings and utterly unbelievable claims about earlier ones, forcing us to develop nuanced approaches that can accommodate both dimensions without artificially separating them. Modern scholars generally adopt what might be called a stratified approach, recognizing that the King List represents layers of tradition accumulated over long periods, with an early mythological core being supplemented over time with more historical material as the list was extended to include contemporary rulers. This process of compilation and revision probably continued for centuries, with each generation of scribes adding new kings to bring the list up to date while preserving the ancient traditions that gave the document its authority and legitimacy. The scribes who maintained the King List were not neutral recorders but active participants in constructing and maintaining a particular vision of Mesopotamian history and political order, and understanding their motivations and methods helps us appreciate why the document takes the form it does. The question of literacy and scribal culture in ancient Sumer adds another crucial dimension to our understanding of the King List because the document could only exist in a society with sophisticated writing systems, trained scribes, and institutions dedicated to preserving and transmitting textual traditions. The development of cuneiform writing in Sumer around 3200 BCE was initially driven by economic necessity, the need to track commodities, labor, and transactions in increasingly complex urban economies. But once established, writing quickly expanded into new domains including royal propaganda, legal codes, literary compositions, and historical records. The scribes who mastered cuneiform underwent years of training, practicing by copying standard texts that included king lists, mathematical tables, lexical lists, and literary works. And through this educational process, they absorbed not just technical skills, but also the cultural values and historical narratives that these texts embodied. The King List would have been among the texts that student scribes copied as part of their training, ensuring that each new generation internalized the same vision of Mesopotamian history stretching back to the antediluvian kings. This pedagogical function helps explain why the King List was so widely distributed and why its basic structure remained relatively stable despite variations in detail, because it served as a foundational text for literate culture in much the same way that the Iliad and Odyssey would later function in Greek education or the Torah in Jewish tradition. The scribal schools, known as aduba or tablet houses, were attached to temples and palaces and produced the bureaucrats, accountants, and administrators needed to run complex urban societies. But they also served as centers for the preservation and creation of literary culture, And the king list stands at the intersection of these functions, being simultaneously a bureaucratic record of political succession and a literary monument celebrating the antiquity and divine sanction of Mesopotamian civilization. The impact of the Sumerian King List extended far beyond Sumer itself, influencing how later Mesopotamian cultures understood and recorded their own histories. When Semitic-speaking Akkadians conquered the Sumerian city-states in the 24th century BCE under Sargon of Akkad, they adopted Sumerian cuneiform writing and much of Sumerian high culture, including the tradition of king lists. Later Babylonian and Assyrian chronicles and king lists show clear influence from the Sumerian original, maintaining similar formats and even preserving information about earlier periods drawn from Sumerian sources. The Babylonian King List, compiled during the Kassite period around 1400 BCE, explicitly connects the Kassite rulers to earlier Babylonian dynasties and threw them back to the Sumerian past, creating a sense of continuity across linguistic and cultural transitions. The Neo-Assyrian kings of the first millennium BCE, ruling from cities like Nineveh and Assur, also maintained king lists and chronicles that traced their legitimacy back through centuries of ancestors to primordial times, though they developed somewhat different conventions for recording and interpreting their past. This persistence of the king list tradition across nearly 2,000 years of Mesopotamian history testifies to the enduring power of the model established by the Sumerian King List, which successfully created a framework for understanding political legitimacy and historical continuity that proved adaptable to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential structure and purpose. The relationship between the King List and other Sumerian literary works, particularly the epics and myths that deal with the same kings and events, reveals how ancient Mesopotamian culture created meaning through interconnected narratives that reinforced and elaborated each other. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which developed from Sumerian poems into the Akkadian epic that became ancient Mesopotamia's most celebrated literary achievement, presents Gilgamesh as a historical king of Uruk whose quest for immortality after the death of his companion Enkidu leads him to Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who has been granted eternal life by the gods. The epic thus connects Gilgamesh to the antediluvian past, as Utnapishtim recounts to Gilgamesh the story of the great flood that destroyed the earlier world, creating a narrative bridge between the pre-flood and post-flood epics that the King List marks as a fundamental division in history. The fact that both the King List and the Gilgamesh epic place Gilgamesh in a specific chronological and genealogical context, as the fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty and the son of the goddess Nin's son and immortal father, suggests these were not independent inventions but rather drew upon common traditions about this legendary figure. Similarly, the myths surrounding Dumuzi and Inanna, which explain the origins of seasonal cycles through the god's death and periodic return from the underworld, connect with the King List's presentation of Dumuzi as an antediluvian king, creating a complex relationship between historical and cosmological time. These intertextual connections demonstrate that Sumerian culture understood history, mythology, and religious belief as mutually reinforcing rather than separate domains, and the King List served as a kind of chronological framework that organized and contextualized the events described in myths and epics. The theological implications of the King List structure, particularly its emphasis on kingship descending from heaven, reflect fundamental Sumerian beliefs about the relationship between divine and human realms. In Sumerian cosmology, the universe was organized hierarchically with the gods dwelling in the heavens, humans living on earth, and various underworld deities ruling the realm of the dead. The gods had created humans to serve them by cultivating the earth and providing offerings, and in return the gods maintained cosmic order and provided for human needs, though the relationship was often portrayed as fraught with tension and misunderstanding. The institution of kingship served as the primary interface between these realms, with the king acting as the god's agent on earth and humanity's representative before the divine powers. This mediating role explains why kingship had to be divinely ordained rather than humanly constructed, because only a king who possessed divine authorization could effectively bridge the gap between heaven and earth. The antediluvian kings, reigning for epochs rather than mere human lifetimes, represented a period when this connection was especially strong and direct, when perhaps the boundary between divine and human was more permeable than it later became. The flood's destruction of the antediluvian world can be understood theologically as marking a new phase in divine-human relations, with the gods establishing greater distance from humanity after nearly annihilating it, and the post-flood kings, while still divinely ordained, operating under conditions of reduced divine presence and favor. This theological narrative justified the Sumerians' present circumstances, explaining why their kings were not as mighty as the legendary rulers of old and why human life was shorter and harder than it had supposedly been in primordial times. The concept of the me, those divine decrees or principles that governed all aspects of civilization, provides another key to understanding the King List's theological framework. According to Sumerian mythology, the me included not just abstract concepts like kingship, priesthood, and justice, but also concrete skills and technologies like metalworking, music, sexual practices, and warfare, everything that distinguished civilized urban life from a state of nature. These me were originally possessed by the gods, particularly Enki, who stored them in his temple at Eridu, and various myths describe how different me were transferred from the gods to humanity or stolen by clever deities or heroes. The most famous of these myths tells how Inanna, goddess of love and war, visited Enki in Eridu and got him drunk, then tricked him into giving her the me, which she carried off to her own city Uruk, and though Enki tried to recover them after sobering up, Inanna successfully defended her prize, bringing civilization's benefits to her people. The King List's placement of the first kings in Eridu makes sense in light of this mythology, because Eridu as Enki's city was the source point from which the me emanated, and kingship as one of the most important me would naturally have first manifested there before spreading to other cities. This mythological geography reinforced Eridu's claim to primacy among Sumerian cities and validated the King List's historical narrative by grounding it in widely known religious traditions. The question of audience for the King List raises interesting considerations about who would have had access to this document and what purposes it served for different groups within Sumerian society. The actual physical tablets containing the King List would have been housed in temple and palace archives, accessible primarily to the scribal elite who could read cuneiform and who used such texts in their professional work and educational activities. However, the information contained in the King List, the names of legendary kings and the sequence of dynasties, would have been known more broadly through oral tradition, public recitations, and the visual culture of monuments and stelae that celebrated royal achievements. The King List thus operated on multiple levels simultaneously, as a technical document used by scribes and administrators, as a piece of propaganda supporting royal ideology, and as a repository of cultural memory shared by the wider population through various media. Different audiences would have engaged with the King List differently, with scribes perhaps more focused on chronological precision and administrative continuity, rulers interested in its legitimizing functions, priests concerned with its theological implications, and common people relating primarily to its most famous figures and dramatic events like the flood. This multiplicity of audiences and functions helps explain the document's complexity and the different kinds of information it combines, because it had to serve varied purposes for varied constituencies. Modern attempts to rationalize or decode the antediluvian reign lengths have produced creative but ultimately inconclusive results, revealing more about modern interpretive assumptions than about ancient realities. Some researchers have tried to find patterns by analyzing the numbers mathematically, looking for arithmetical or geometric relationships that might reveal an underlying system or code. These analyses have noted that many of the reign lengths are multiples of 60 or its factors, which makes sense given the Sumerian sexagesimal mathematical system, but this observation doesn't really explain why these particular multiples were chosen or what they might mean. Other researchers have attempted astronomical explanations, suggesting the numbers might correspond to planetary periods, precessional cycles, or other celestial phenomena, but these interpretations require such extensive manipulation of the data, converting units, adjusting baselines, and selectively including or excluding figures that they tend to tell us more about the ingenuity of the interpreter than about the original meaning of the text. A more anthropologically informed approach recognizes that ancient peoples often understood time differently than we do, not as a linear succession of uniform units, but as a more fluid medium shaped by the significance of events and the status of participants. In this view, the extraordinary reign lengths of the antediluvian kings reflect not an attempt at precise chronological measurement, but rather an expression of the qualitative difference between primordial and historical time, and the numbers function more like poetic imagery than like data points. Just as we might say someone is larger than life without intending a literal measurement, the Sumerian scribes might have assigned impossibly long reigns to convey that these kings existed in a different temporal mode than ordinary humans. This interpretation has the advantage of taking the text seriously while not requiring us to believe that anyone actually ruled for 28,000 years, and it aligns with what we know about how myth and history functioned in ancient Near Eastern cultures. The legacy of the Sumerian King List extends into modern times in ways both scholarly and popular, influencing how we understand ancient history and sometimes feeding into less rigorous speculations about humanity's past. In academic contexts, the King List has been intensively studied since its first publication and translation in the early 20th century, generating extensive scholarly literature analyzing its composition, dating, textual variants, historical reliability, and cultural significance. The document has proved invaluable for reconstructing the sequence of early Mesopotamian dynasties and for understanding ancient chronology, even though the earliest portions remain impossible to verify independently. The King List has also influenced broader discussions about how ancient peoples understood and recorded their pasts, contributing to the development of more sophisticated approaches to ancient historiography that recognize the cultural specificity of historical consciousness. In popular contexts, however, the King List has sometimes been appropriated by fringe theorists who interpret its extraordinary claims literally as evidence for ancient astronauts, lost civilizations, antediluvian high technology, or other unconventional scenarios. These interpretations typically ignore the cultural context that makes sense of the document's apparent anomalies, and instead treat it as a puzzle whose solution lies in dramatic revelations about humanity's hidden past. While mainstream scholarship dismisses such approaches as misguided and methodologically flawed, they do reflect a genuine fascination with the mysteries that documents like the King List present, and they remind us that ancient texts can spark imagination and wonder even when they don't yield simple answers to our questions. The challenge for serious students of the past is to maintain that sense of wonder while also employing rigorous methods that help us understand what ancient texts actually meant in their original contexts rather than what we might wish them to mean. As we reflect on the significance of the Sumerian King List for understanding human civilization's development, several broad conclusions emerge that illuminate both the specific case of ancient Mesopotamia and larger patterns in how cultures construct and maintain historical memory. First, the King List demonstrates that sophisticated urban civilizations emerged earlier and developed more complex cultural institutions than was once appreciated, with the Sumerians creating elaborate systems for recording and transmitting their past that influenced subsequent Near Eastern cultures for millennia. Second, the document reveals that ancient peoples did not distinguish between myth and history in the sharp way modern Western culture does, but rather understood both as essential components of cultural identity that work together to explain their origins and justify their present circumstances. Third, the King List shows how political power in ancient societies was intimately connected with religious authority, with kings requiring divine sanction to rule legitimately, and with the maintenance of proper relationships between human and divine realms being a central concern of governance. Fourth, the document illustrates how texts served multiple simultaneous functions in ancient societies, operating as administrative records, political propaganda, educational materials, and repositories of cultural memory all at once. Fifth, the King List exemplifies the challenges historians face when working with ancient sources that don't conform to modern expectations about what historical documents should look like. requiring us to develop interpretive frameworks sophisticated enough to handle the complexity and ambiguity inherent in such texts. These lessons extend beyond the specific case of the Sumerian King List to inform how we approach ancient history more generally, reminding us that the past was experienced and understood differently by those who lived it than it is by us who study it from vast temporal and cultural distances. The Sumerian King List ultimately stands as a testament to humanity's deep need to understand where we came from and how we got here, to place ourselves within narratives that connect past, present, and future into meaningful wholes. The Sumerians, like all peoples, told themselves stories about their origins, and these stories served essential functions in creating social cohesion, legitimizing institutions, and providing frameworks for making sense of their world. The fact that we cannot take the antediluvian portions of the King List literally as historical records does not diminish their significance as cultural artifacts that reveal what the Sumerians believed about themselves and their place in the cosmos. When the scribes who carved the weld blundell prism inscribed those extraordinary reign lengths, they were not trying to deceive anyone or recording absurdities they themselves didn't believe. They were transmitting traditions they had received from earlier generations and that formed part of their civilization's sacred heritage. These traditions told them that their ancestors had lived in closer proximity to the gods, that kingship was a divine gift essential for social order, that a great catastrophe had once nearly destroyed humanity but the gods had allowed it to survive and rebuild, and that they stood in an unbroken line of succession extending back to the very dawn of time. Whether these traditions preserved any kernel of historical truth beneath layers of mythological elaboration is ultimately less important than recognizing that they expressed profound truths about how the Sumerians understood their identity and their world. In studying the Sumerian King List, we are not just learning about ancient Mesopotamian history. We are encountering a fundamentally different way of experiencing and conceptualizing time, causation, authority, and human nature itself, and this encounter challenges us to question our own assumptions about what history is and how it should be understood. The mystery of the 241,200 years will likely never be definitively solved because it may not have been a mystery to those who created it, and our inability to crack the code may simply reflect the vast cultural distance between ancient Sumer and the modern world. Perhaps the lesson we should take from the King List is not that we need to explain away its apparent impossibilities, but rather that we should appreciate how ancient peoples created meaning through narrative frameworks that blended what we would call history and myth into unified wholes that served their needs even if they confound ours. The antediluvian kings, whether they were gods, heroes, dynasties, symbols, or memories of real rulers distorted beyond recognition by millennia of transmission, represented something essential to Sumerian identity, a link to sacred origins that validated their civilization and explained their present condition. In the end, the Sumerian King List speaks to us across 4,000 years as a voice from humanity's first literate civilization, telling us that we are the inheritors of traditions extending back into unimaginable antiquity, that our ancestors sought meaning and connection and understanding just as we do, that they looked at the ruins of even more ancient cities and wondered about the people who built them, that they contemplated deep time and tried to comprehend their place within it. The King List reminds us that history is not just what happened, but also what people believed happened and how they chose to remember and transmit those beliefs to future generations. Whether the antediluvian kings ever walked the earth or existed only in mythology and imagination, they walked through the minds of countless Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians who saw themselves as part of a story that began when kingship first descended from heaven to the primordial city of Eridu. And in studying this document, we become part of that story's ongoing transmission, adding our own interpretations and questions to the accumulated wisdom and wonder of millennia. The mystery endures, inviting each generation to grapple anew with these ancient claims and to ask what they might mean for our understanding of human civilization's origins. And perhaps that enduring mystery, that refusal to yield simple answers, is itself the King List's most valuable legacy. A reminder that the past remains partially opaque and that some questions are worth asking even when definitive answers elude us.